We're honored to be joined again by Craig Mokhiber. Craig is an international human rights lawyer and former senior United Nations official. He left the UN in October 2023, penning a widely read letter that warned of genocide in Gaza, criticized the international response, and called for a new approach to Palestine and Israel based on equality, human rights, and international law. Craig's most recent appearance on the Electronic Intifada live stream was at the end of February. It doesn't seem like it was that long ago, but I guess it was. We discussed international law in the context of Israel's genocide in Gaza at a time when more than 25,000 Palestinians had been confirmed killed since October 2023. As of the beginning of this week, that figure has nearly doubled, with the Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza having recorded the deaths of 43,600 Palestinians killed in Israeli attacks, a figure that doesn't include the thousands of people missing under the rubble or who have died from disease as a result of Israel's siege, a number that some credible estimates put as high as 200,000. Thank you so much, Craig, for coming back on the Electronic Intifada live stream.
Thank you, Nora. Thanks, Ali. Nice to be with you again.
It's our honor. So let's start with major developments at the UN and at the International Criminal Court since you were on the live stream in late February. In May, Karim Khan, the International Criminal Court chief prosecutor, requested arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, Israel's prime minister and recently fired defense minister, as well as 3 Hamas leaders who have since been killed. Those arrest warrants have not yet been issued, and in recent weeks, the ICC judge in charge of approving those warrants suddenly resigned for unspecified health reasons. Also, Karim Khan is facing calls to temporarily step down from his position over allegations of sexual misconduct, while he's being probed by the court's governing body, the Assembly of States Parties. What does all this mean? And is it an indication of potential external meddling that serves to delay serving arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant? And is the International Criminal Court truly an independent judiciary that acts without fear or favor, a court of last resort, as they say, for the world's most vulnerable victims? How do you see what's happening?
Well, it's impossible to see the sequence of events that have occurred in and around the ICC over the course of the last year in particular, and not conclude that there is indeed some serious external meddling taking place. These things are public. We are aware that the United States government very publicly for years has been threatening the court since even before the so-called Hague Invasion Act, where the US Congress passed a law saying that if the ICC were to dare to prosecute an American or any of its allies, that they're authorized to take any measures, including armed force, to liberate the criminal defendant from the ICC. That has only gotten worse over time, and of course that is just added to the revelations in recent months of a decade of threats and intimidation by Mossad and other Israeli intelligence operatives against officials of the ICC to coerce and frighten them out of proceeding on the Palestine file. And, you know, when Karim Khan made the announcement of the request for arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant, he included in that very statement this extraordinary warning that we haven't heard him before, that all attempts to impede, intimidate, or improperly influence the court must cease immediately. He didn't say what those threats were, but of course, people who had been following the court knew what he was talking about. But he also said that they would not hesitate to act under Article 70 of the Rome Statute if these threats continue. And Article 70 empowers the prosecutor and the ICC to actually bring criminal prosecutions against those that try to intimidate or obstruct the court in any way. Then what happened was the court, which is normal in its procedures, set up a sort of pretrial chamber of 3 judges that was headed by a Romanian judge named Iulia Motoc. And you know, just days later after that, we get this revelation in The Guardian and Plus 972 magazine about this decade of interference and threats and really sabotage against the ICC and its prosecutor by the Mossad in an effort to derail any prosecutions of Israelis. Then the court goes silent. And that silence lasts for 5 months, for over 5 months until till today, which is very, very unusual to have this kind of a delay in the issuance of warrants that have been requested, particularly when this warrant request was the most cautious, I would say trepidatious warrant request by a prosecutor ever in the history of the court. Karim Khan, who, in my view, has demonstrated that he did not want to issue any arrest warrants, that he was not inclined to do so, but he was compelled to do so by the public attention of the live stream genocide that we've been witnessing. He made the request. He was compelled to make the request. And then we get all of these delays. And then on top of all of that, we suddenly get pro-Israel publications circulating anonymous third-party allegations accusing Karim Khan, the prosecutor, of harassing a female staff member. And that we can talk about that as well. But right after that, a few days later, the presiding judge in the pretrial chamber, Judge Motok, suddenly steps down, and the court cites unspecified health reasons and doesn't provide any other information. And then she's replaced with Judge Betty Holler, who's a Slovenian judge, and her role as the presiding judge is taken over by the French judge, Nicolas Grieux, who now presides over that pretrial chamber. So you have a very significant personnel change in the chamber that's considering whether to issue the warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant that were requested by the prosecutor. And then, a whole chain of public threats by the United States, the Congress, but also the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, and the President himself against the ICC if it proceeds. So there is no question that has been massive interference externally, behind the scenes and publicly, in order to derail the prosecution of these Israeli officials. What we don't know is whether, and I strongly suspect it is, whether the change in personnel in the pretrial chamber was something that was done, whether the so-called health reasons were either caused by or cover for influence that was brought to bear on the presiding judge, Motok, that caused her to step down, and whether the judges that have replaced her, so the French judge taking over as the presiding judge and the Slovenian judge being added to the channel, whether this was done, and I suspect it was, to cause further delays, because the delay acts in the favor of the Israeli defendants in a lot of different ways, not least because it allows further machinations behind the scenes to try to affect what is happening, or whether the change in personnel was done either for real or perceived differences in perspectives on the part of the judges. And I've written that these judges who have effectively now taken over the portfolio, the French judge and the Slovenian judge, have on the public record some at least roots of concern that there might be something substantive going on here. Judge Holler had published an article that I found from 2015, where she makes a very weak argument that complementarity might bar scrutiny of Israel, which has been debunked by down the street in The Hague by the International Court of Justice, but also by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, who said that there's no evidence that the Israelis have any intention or have taken any steps to prosecute, investigate and prosecute Netanyahu and Gallant. It's not, but the reasoning she gave, she said, quote, Israel in general has a well-functioning legal system headed by a respected Supreme Court. Well, of course, your viewers and others will know that there has been for decades broad international criticism of the Israeli Supreme Court, which was already evident in 2015 when she wrote this article, because it has a long record of approving apartheid policies, state crimes against Palestinians, tolerance of war crimes, activities in the occupied territories, and so on. And there's no evidence that Israel has any intention of prosecuting Netanyahu or Gallant. So, did that affect the decision to assign her to the chamber? We don't know, but there's at least cause to question. And then she also, in that same article, talked about how the ICC is heavily dependent on the support of states parties, including, the dominant Western or European parties, because they can't enforce it without the support of those states. And what I've said is that may be true, but that should play no role in decisions by the judges on the merits. Then you've got this Judge Guillou of France. This guy's entire profile is as a counterterrorism lawyer. That's where he built his career, and that's what brought him to the court. He doesn't come from the human rights side, for example. He served as the chef de cabinet for the Special Tribunal for Lebanon that convicted a Hezbollah member in the assassination of Rafik Hariri. He served as a liaison to the U.S. Justice Department, working on counterterrorism prosecutions at the height of the so-called war on terrorism. And he has argued to try to get international tribunals to prosecute non-state terrorism, which is something that human rights defenders and others are very concerned about, because there is no definition of terrorism in international law. It is, by definition, a political distinction, and it has played a very corrosive role in the protections that are afforded through international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and so on. So that's his profile, and he's now presiding over the chamber, a role that the Romanian judge who stepped down was previously playing. Now, it doesn't mean that these are unethical judges who are going to ignore the facts and the law, but it is not, I've said the law is not a machine where you just sort of feed in the facts and the law and out comes a neutral decision. The opinions and experiences and biases of judges matter in these decisions, and anyone who wanted to affect the way this chamber was operating will have been aware of that when the personnel changes were made. So, then you add to that the pressure campaigns on these judges. And we all remember what happened when Judge Richard Goldstone was heading the UN fact-finding mission on Gaza in 2009 with a group of distinguished jurists and one of the most skilled staffs, expert staffs that a UN commission has ever had, produced this report on Gaza in 2009, and then was the subject of an enormous Israeli pressure campaign behind the scenes and publicly, and a smearing and slander campaign, and he broke under pressure. He essentially recanted the findings of the mission, although he had no power to do so, and everyone else involved in the mission stayed firm. And in the process, this guy who had had this long, storied career as a judge and even a human rights defender, his reputation in international legal and human rights circles was completely destroyed. And I think with it, he is well. And then you've got this allegation against Karim Khan. Now, I've never been a fan of Karim Khan. I think that he was appointed in significant measure because he reassured Western powers that he would not go after Israel, he would not go after the Americans in the Afghanistan case, he would not go after the Brits in the Afghanistan case, and so on. So that was a big part of his predisposition, and explains why you had such a long delay. Well, having been compelled to act by the public screening of the genocide in Palestine, he then did what was principled and what he was required to do. Well, suddenly you get this very tiny anonymous X account, Twitter account, that tweeted this unsubstantiated third-party allegation that Karim Khan had somehow harassed a female staff member. And then the Daily Mail, which people know is this right-wing pro-Israel tabloid in the UK that has been for a long time discredited as just a source of Israeli disinformation. I said that even English Wikipedia had banned it as a source because of its unreliability and fabrications. And if Wikipedia is banning you for being unreliable, that's really saying something. They found the Daily Mail somehow. I mean, were they following this thing of a few followers on this X account? How did they find this account and then reprint the allegations? And then that was repeated in the usual pattern by all these pro-Israel Western news sites, in the story as well. Now, Khan has denied them. I don't know if there's any truth to them. I'm never surprised when a man in a position of power harasses somebody on his staff, but he has denied them, and he has said they are a part of this campaign of harassment against he and the court for their work on the Palestine file. We also know that the victim or the alleged victim never filed any complaint, that the court's independent oversight mechanism consulted her, and neither she nor they decided that to proceed with any investigations or charges of any kind. But what we know is that it quickly became fodder for a campaign to delegitimize the prosecutor, the ICC, and the case against the Israeli perpetrators. And you can see this when they actually, some of these Western media outlets ran stories with headlines like "War Crimes Prosecutor Who Charged Netanyahu Accused of Sexual Misconduct." So trying to link, to discredit him in order to link it to this story. There's a lot going on there. I think what is, and I think the court, the judges, the prosecutor, they all know that their reputations are at stake because the world is watching. But for the Israelis and for the Americans, they are also facing a legal risk because, as I said when I started commenting, and I'll finish here, Article 70 of the Rome Statute says that this kind of interference with the work of the court is an international crime, and it grants jurisdiction to the ICC itself to prosecute those crimes. And so they need to be thinking not just about reputation; they need to be thinking about legal claims that I expect, if this continues, will come against them. I don't know, to conclude, whether or not the court will do the right thing, whether it has been so corrupted that it will not do the right thing. But I know that they know that the world is watching. I know that we need to be vigilant. And I know that our vigilance and our attention and our demand for justice has to be louder than the pressure that those judges are receiving in the dark. And I think with that, there is still a choice that belatedly these historic warrants could be issued, and we might see another crack in the wall of impunity that Israel has been enjoying. Sorry, I spoke a long time there, but it's a long story.
Thank you, Craig. That was extraordinarily detailed, and I think you answered a lot of questions that many of us have about what's going on at the ICC. And you pointed out. I mean, it just strikes me listening to you. If this had been, say, Russian interference in the ICC, this would be the top story around the world on The Guardian, the BBC, and so on. But because it's Mossad or Israeli interference, it flies under the radar. And of course, as we've pointed out before, when the ICC prosecutor issued warrants for the arrest of Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, on a rather flimsy charge from my reading, and certainly nothing, even if he were guilty of it, it's nothing even close to what the Israeli leaders are accused of. The judges took just 3 weeks to issue the warrant. We're now coming up on 6 months, and they've done nothing on the request to issue these warrants. But let's turn our attention to another international court. This is the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court, that also sits in The Hague, but it's a separate body from the International Criminal Court. And in July, they handed down a historic ruling, an advisory opinion, that Israel's prolonged military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip is illegal in itself, and they ordered that Israel end its occupation within a year. It's now obviously 4 or 5 months since then, and no moves towards that. But in a piece you wrote for Mondoweiss in July, you wrote that this stunning advisory opinion had dealt a definitive blow to decades of US and Western efforts to situate Israel outside the reach of the rule of law. But we can see that Israel's genocide is only intensifying. Its aggression is now expanding to Lebanon. Have UN member states changed their policies towards Israel based on these World Court rulings, this recent one and previous ones upholding Palestinian rights? Or is this bubble of impunity around Israel simply impenetrable, making these decisions merely symbolic? What are you seeing from your perspective as someone who has worked within the international human rights system?
Well, it's not impenetrable. It's formidable, to be sure, because it is underwritten and insured by the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany and much of the West, and it is maintained by a fear, a sort of constant campaign of fear against international actors who would challenge that impunity. But it's not impenetrable, and it has been penetrated more in the past year than in previous decades. I think it has been remarkable. And that comes from, if I can say so, from the streets. That comes from ordinary people. That comes from those who are standing up to challenge that impunity, because these international actors would not act without that pressure. That's what's changing everything. And it was extraordinary, because this opinion of the ICJ, which is stating binding international law, what binding international law says, which includes, as you say, not just an end to the occupation, which they found to be entirely unlawful, but a total dismantling of every settlement, a removal of every soldier, a repeal of every applicable law, the removal of the wall, the compensation of Palestinians, the right to return for Palestinians, the declaration that Israel is practicing racial segregation and apartheid, and that the international community has to band together to oppose that apartheid as well, that it has to implement the provisional members of the ICJ in the genocide case. This was a pretty comprehensive decision, and now the General Assembly took up every single line of that in September and adopted an implementing resolution, which is again historic, and which 124 countries, 2/3 of the world, voted in favor, while only 14 voted against. The US, Israel, a few right-wing regimes, and what I call Pacific dependencies of the US. And even Western countries like Spain and Belgium and Ireland, Iceland voted in favor, as well as US allies like Japan, other P5 powers like China and Russia, and almost the entire global South, which is the majority, right? They voted in favor. They committed to this. They greeted its adoption with applause. This was a really important moment of this. And why this is important, we've talked about this before. The past 30 plus years, this could not happen because of the Oslo ruse, this thing that I've called a smokescreen, which was put up to allow further dispossession and settlement activity and violations of international law. We've now returned to a framework of international law. Now, it's not instantaneous. You don't, in the international system, bang a gavel and then that law is implemented. And I think the General Assembly has recognized this, because they set up a series of steps. And by the way, I need to say this every time. None of this is an adequate response to a genocide that continues to unfold in Palestine, and for which immediate relief is needed. None of this will help in that case. What it does is it builds a process by which that impunity can be chipped away in the way that the impunity in South Africa under apartheid was chipped away. So it's important. It's a real paradigm shift. We're moving away from this idea that Palestinians have to negotiate for their rights with their Israeli oppressor and their American oppressor. And the court and the GA have said, no, these are human rights which they can demand immediately. They don't have to negotiate for them. And it is the job of all the other states in the world to use whatever power they have to make this come true. So that is very significant. Now, it is not going to happen immediately. They're waiting for the report from the Secretary General that's going to lay out some options. It's frustrating to see how the international system works sometimes, because it's very incremental and step by step. They have to get the plans in place to establish a mechanism to ensure that Israel pays reparations, which is a part of this, set up this international register of damage that's a part of this, some evidence gathering initiatives. That's the easy part, because the evidence has already been gathered by the International Court of Justice, by the UN human rights mechanisms, and others. They have to make proposals on how to ensure criminal accountability, which could include a tribunal, a dedicated tribunal, which would avoid the problem of the reticence and the meddling that's been going on with the ICC and sometimes the ICJ. Convening a conference of high contracting parties to the Geneva Conventions. There's a 6-month deadline for that. Convening an international conference at the UN on Israel's violations of international resolutions. a 3-month report of the Secretary General. All of this is a kind of a step-by-step process over the period of a year, which is again too slow, to move to further, I forget what the exact language is, but further repercussions for the state of Israel. Now, behind the scenes, there is a lot happening. There are a lot of movements between civil society actors and individual member states to bring action on these areas to, for example, reestablish the anti-apartheid mechanisms, to bring more pressure on Israel, to support boycott, divestment, sanctions, all of those sorts of things that help to change the South African situation. And I think all of that, is very important. The current configuration, let me stop there and we can talk about more depending on how you want to focus it.
Well, I wanted to ask a specific question. In the live stream news report that we did before this, we highlighted a warning by international aid organizations that the UN and the UN, that starvation is still being used as a weapon of war, especially in the northern Gaza Strip. Several international human rights groups have called on the UN to formally declare a famine there, which would immediately require that international bodies pursue legal action, as you were saying, against Israel. Can you take us through why it hasn't been declared yet, and what happens when and if it is declared? Does the UN have a way to enforce this requirement against Israel in any way?
I mean, there's no question. Nobody is waiting to declare that starvation is being used as a weapon of war. This is agreed across the humanitarian human rights community and the human rights side of the UN as well. Famine, the international mechanisms are extremely clumsy in declaring, when there is like a full-blown famine. We know people are already starving to death, especially the most vulnerable, the youngest, and so on. So there's no question about that, and that's one of the reasons, by the way, that was because there was, Karim Khan looked for the strongest cases that he could bring against the Israelis, and using food as a weapon of war was one of the strongest things that was laid out there, and that is also why the U.S. has dedicated so much resources to trying to create plausible deniability over the starvation tactics of the Israelis. The U.S. State Department spokesperson every day tries to pretend that somehow allowing a trickle of trucks in once in a while proves that they are not using starvation as a weapon of war, because they know that they are very exposed in this regard. So there's no question of that. The clumsiness of the international mechanisms on issuing a single declaration of famine is something that is not new, but they are as close as I've ever seen them in cases like this. I don't think in that case we're looking at intimidation or whatever. I think we're looking at clumsiness. I mean, one of the many lessons learned of this genocide is that the international mechanisms set up to prevent and stop and punish these actions are wholly inadequate, that they have failed absolutely, that in the medium to long term, we may well see justice in the form of accountability for some perpetrators, some redress for some survivors, but we will have paid a horrific price in the loss of the victims who did not survive the genocide and in the decades of suffering that is going to follow this regardless. But the use of food as a weapon of war is beyond question. And I would encourage your viewers to look at the report by the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food at the United Nations, Fakhri, who has laid out with tremendous clarity how food has been used as a weapon of war and the crimes that are included in that.
We're gonna talk more later in the program about the U.S. continuing to cover up for all of this. But Craig, I want to ask you now, again, just drawing on your expertise and your experience at the UN. Back in 2020, the Palestinian Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions National Committee stated that Israeli apartheid would not be addressed unless states that have emerged from the struggle against racist colonial domination lead the way, as they did with the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. Now, the Boycott National Committee is currently calling for the suspension of Israel from the UN and has sent out a letter template that individuals can use to urge the president of the UN General Assembly, who's currently Philemon Yang of Cameroon, urging him to initiate the suspension of Israel. Have former colonized states like Cameroon stepped up, or is there more they can do? Do you think it is a possibility that Israel, which has killed more than 230 UN workers in Gaza since October last year and has repeatedly threatened and deliberately attacked UN peacekeepers in Lebanon in recent months, might be suspended by the UN General Assembly, just as apartheid South Africa was half a century ago? Is that something that could happen?
It is something that could happen. It's not going to be easy, but I believe that it is going to be possible. And you mentioned the global south, the role of the global south. Is overwhelmingly the countries of the global south, without even talking about the people of the global south, are fully on board and in solidarity with the people of Palestine, including on this demand that Israel be held accountable in the way that South Africa was held accountable. And you see the role that South Africa has played in bringing the genocide case. I mean, the global south has been there. It's laid out in the voting records in the UN and so on. Now, there are some exceptions. Israel's been working for decades to carve out pieces of the global south and has successfully done so in some Latin American countries and in a disturbing number of African countries by using military aid, intelligence support, some development assistance in some areas, tech, Israeli tech, and so on, to carve out corrupt regimes in the global south to get them to vote along. You know, the current president of the General Assembly is President Yang, who's the former prime minister of Cameroon. And Cameroon has been one of those states that should be a frontline state, but has actually been complicit with Israel. In some cases, even voting with Israel alone as the only other state besides Israel to vote against a resolution on support to Palestine refugees. And a number of other resolutions as well, where it voted with some other pro-Israel actors. So, you know, Cameroon has not been a principled actor in all of this, and they currently are the president of the GA. Now, this happens because, you know, just to go back a little bit, you know, suspending or expelling a country from the UN under the normal provisions of the Charter requires agreement of the Security Council. And we know the US and the UK will never, ever agree, and they will veto any such effort. So the way they got around this in the South Africa case during apartheid was the US, the UK, and France vetoed the effort to suspend South Africa. They vetoed it in the Security Council. The president of the GA and the majority of the GA then went forward and they said, okay, we don't have the power to do that, but we can suspend their participation in the General Assembly, which is basically the parliament of the body. And the way they did that was when the Credentials Committee was approving participation for each country at the beginning of the session of the General Assembly, they denied that approval to South Africa. They can do the same thing to Israel. Now, that process has already taken place for the current General Assembly. So President Yang, he's not going to be the president of the GA when this happens. It's going to happen in the beginning of the next session. It's going to happen in the fall, in next fall, if it is going to happen. That's when it would happen. And the head of the Credentials Committee will also change. Currently, that's Solomon Islands, and you know some of these Pacific islands have also been co-opted by Israel. But that's going to change. That's going to change as well. And then, most importantly, as I said, you already have the majority. We just had a resolution, I think yesterday or the day before, in this Arab Islamic summit, where they all called for suspending Israel's participation. A lot of G77 members are going to support that. I think that they will have a numerical majority. Now, what will the US, I mean Israel obviously, but what will the US and the UK do between now and then to try to peel off votes? You can bet they're going to use every carrot and stick. but it's still possible. And I think what is most compelling here is that what they cannot deny is that there has never been a country in the history of the UN that's been more deserving of, as a minimum, of suspension from the General Assembly. Israel has been consistently violating the principles of the Charter since 1948. It's done so since it was admitted, first in carving out the state through genocide and ethnic cleansing, violating the Universal Declaration, the UN Charter, the Genocide Convention. And then even those early resolutions, 181 and 194 that they talk so much about, those are supposed to allow Palestinian right of return. Wasn't allowed, right? Those were supposed to recognize Palestinian sovereignty. That hasn't been allowed by Israel. And today, Israel has the world record for the violation of UN conventions, UN resolutions of the Security Council, General Assembly, the Commission on Human Rights, Human Rights Council, the defiance of applicable ICJ rulings, and the defiance of Security Council resolutions, which is a violation of Article 25 of the UN Charter. It's on trial for genocide. There are arrest warrants for crimes against humanity, against its leaders. It's been found to be perpetrating apartheid. The occupation is illegal. All of that, not to mention transnational terror attacks, foreign assassinations, aggression against half a dozen, or at least 4 or 5 UN member states that are suffering under Israeli aggression. And then here's the thing that they cannot deny in the GA discussions. It has been attacking the United Nations itself. This is unprecedented. It blocks UN investigations. It bans UN personnel. It PNG'd the Secretary General of the UN. It has repeatedly attacked and obstructed UNRWA. It has killed more UN staff than any party in history, more than 230 UN staff in the last year alone, many along with their families. It has detained and tortured countless UN staff. It has attacked and slandered and obstructed the organization and its operations. And as you said, Ali, it has attacked UN peacekeepers in Lebanon, and repeatedly so. It has invaded and pillaged and bombed UN premises, schools, clinics, warehouses, and so on. So there has never been a case in the history of the United Nations where it has been more justified to suspend an actor. They will have a hard time in ignoring this when the discussion comes up. So I think between now and the Credentials Committee that will open in the fall, that the movement, which is a very strong one that's happening now, of civil society actors and member states to suspend Israel, could be successful if we keep at it. And I'm not ready to give up. If it is not, and I just say this, if Israel is not at least suspended from the General Assembly, the credibility of that institution tanks. Everybody's watching, and it will mean that the idea of suspending or expelling a member from any UN body, which is written into the rules of the organization, will become dead letter, and it will be another blow against the international institutions themselves, in this case, the UN, which have suffered horrendous collateral damage because of the distortions of the past year. So I am hoping and believing that it is still possible for this actually to occur between now and next fall.
Craig, as you know, the U.S. voted last week to elect Donald Trump to a second term. During his first term, the U.S. froze funding to UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees. The U.S. quit the UN Human Rights Council. Nikki Haley, Washington's envoy at the time, called the body a, quote, cesspool of political bias, largely because of the council's efforts toward ending Israeli impunity. The Biden administration rejoined the Human Rights Council, but we've seen that same administration run constant interference for Israel's genocide by vetoing and otherwise undermining Security Council resolutions, ordering a ceasefire in Gaza. It was reported this week that Trump has nominated Elise Stefanik, a member of Congress from New York, who said that saying Intifada amounts to a call for genocide, and Stefanik's going to be his administration's ambassador to the UN now. Following that appointment, you stated on X, also known as Twitter, that other countries send diplomats to serve as UN ambassadors. The US always sends AIPAC-approved Israeli shills, and this time one who is also an abrasive, bigoted, far-right clown. a fitting pick to represent the rapid decline of the US on the world stage. What do you think a second Trump administration will mean for efforts toward holding Israel accountable to international law at the UN and other international forums?
Do you think my X tweet was too diplomatic? I'm sorry. It's because I've been in the UN so long.
I feel like you were restrained. Yeah.
I mean, it's it's very much what we expected. And by the way, if you want proof of that tweet, just watch any of the confirmation hearings of UN ambassadors, the one that will come up for Stefanik and any of those previous ambassadors under Democrats and Republicans, and you will see that the main focus of those hearings on the UN ambassador from US members of the Congress are on Israel. It is a process set up to get a strong pledge that you will defend Israel in the United Nations, not the United States, but Israel. So this is very much what we expected. Trump is putting together an administration, comprised of some of the worst characters dredged up from the darkest corners of the U.S. I mean, if you look at the list of names, it's like a hodgepodge of fascist and white nationalist and Zionist and neocons and racist and xenophobes. So we know what to expect from a crowd like this. And it's going to be a dangerous 4 years under Trump. There's no denying it. It'll be dangerous for people here in the US, and it'll be dangerous for the people of the world, especially in the Middle East and especially the Palestinian people. I think what you're going to see is more gross and systematic violations of the rights of human rights defenders in this country, for example, those protesting against the genocide. And it will start with them and be most brutal against us. So Trump is a real threat to all of us. But, in the same breath, I have to say, let's not forget, we've just endured a 4-year term under Biden and Harris, in which the administration undid none of Trump's policies on the Middle East from the previous 4 years, illegal annexations, you name it. And it carried out a genocide in Palestine and the crime of aggression across the Middle East. So that was under this Democratic administration. And it was under that administration that we saw this unprecedented, open, brutal repression of human rights defenders in the U.S. on college campuses and workplaces, in the streets, in media spaces, and so on. So we're going to go from genocide abroad and repression at home in the U.S. to more genocide abroad and repression at home in the U.S. on January 20th. It's going to be more of the same. There's a difference because Trump won't waste time on the mendacious pretense of civility and humanitarian concern that was peddled by Biden and Harris, as it murdered babies in their thousands, right? And of course, Trump has to pay back the $100 million check that he got from Marianne Adelson. And to do that, he'll probably recognize the annexation of the West Bank and other insane and unlawful moves. And so it will be disgusting, but the de facto annexation was already achieved under Republican and Democratic administrations for decades. And it's been expedited under Biden and Harris in the last few years. And even if that happens, the U.S. saying that it recognizes the annexation of the West Bank has no effect in international law. There's no legal effect at all. The U.S. doesn't have the authority to legalize annexation. It'll just be another statement of one rogue state supporting another rogue state. And I have to say, it's not going to harm the ultimate inevitable outcome in the long term, which is a one-state democratic post-apartheid solution. So there's plenty to fear, but to pretend that we've just gone from a paradise into hell is ignoring the fact that we've just gone from hell into another room in hell. But just to directly answer your question, I think Trump is going to go after the UN in a big way. He's going to go after the ICJ and the ICC in a big way. And we have to make sure that the public demand for justice is louder than the pressure on these institutions. That's our job. But Biden and Harris did the same thing, and every administration going back to 1948, right? Remember that this past year, when these right-wing members of Congress declared that the U.S. must punish the ICC for going after Israeli criminals, Blinken and Sullivan and Biden all publicly agreed and pledged to cooperate in punishing the ICC. That was this Democratic administration. So I just think this disease of violent racism in U.S. foreign policy and racist repression at home is a lot deeper than, 4-year red or blue pigment of the skin. It's a virus that infects every cell of the government. And what it means is that for another 4 years, we have to resist as we have these 4 years everywhere and always, that when they try to intimidate us, we can't bow down. We have to raise our voices louder. That if we have a demonstration of 100 people and they ban us, we got to come back the next day with 1,000, right? So there wasn't a lot of hope in the last 4 years. There's not a lot of hope in these 4 years, but the degree to which we can find opportunities for progress depends on what we do. We have to be in it for the long game, right? If you think about the Palestinian people who are admired everywhere for their steadfastness, even in a century of oppression, the least we can do is to stand up against this kind of Democrat, Republican duopoly oppression.
Well, Craig, we have another segment where we're going to talk more about this, but it's hard to disagree with your assessment at all that it is going to be more of the same, maybe with different flavoring. But I'm struck I think just before we went live, there was the video of President Biden receiving Donald Trump in the Oval Office. And if you watch the video clip, Biden saying, "Congratulations on your victory and welcome back, Mr. President-elect, former president, you're going to be president again. Welcome back to the White House." All smiles. And this is, 5 minutes ago, they were telling us that Trump is a fascist dictator this is going to be the last election in the history of the United States because Trump is going to ban elections and he's so uniquely dangerous. And here they are smiling and shaking hands in front of the camera and pledging to do everything they can to ensure a smooth transition to the fascist dictatorship that they claim they were opposing. It's, the hypocrisy and mendaciousness is stunning. But Craig, just before we let you go, I'm going to be very unfair because I'm going to put a difficult question to you and ask you to try to address it in a couple of minutes. But you recently said that Israel and its proxies are creating the blueprint for the 21st century by bulldozing the boundaries of acceptable state behavior. If systematic torture, summary executions, massacres, murder of children, doctors, journalists, humanitarians, and all civilians are acceptable, if international law is no longer in effect, if apartheid and genocide are now okay, we're all in trouble. End quote. I mean, my comment is that's an understatement. But can you expand on that? What can those of us who are not in positions of state and institutional power do to resist this? You alluded to some of that, and you said all these responses by states and otherwise are not enough. But where do you see people's energy going that you find hopeful and motivating to keep up this struggle as we have to do?
Well, I mean, I think that the threat is real. I think that, there has been an effort since the Second World War to build up a system in which there was some hope of, of rule of law at the international level, where you could put the human rights of people at the center of that, where power could be held accountable. It has been a weak, inchoate, inconsistent structure that has been built up over the course of these 80 years since the establishment of the UN. But it has offered a platform for people and nations to try to strengthen that system. It proved to be very important for decolonization in the 1960s and 70s. It proved to be very important for the end of apartheid as well. And now all of that, everything from the prohibition of genocide to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the prohibition of aggression in the UN Charter to the idea of sovereign equality, decolonization, all of that is now at risk, and the front lines are in Palestine for all of that. And all of the forces of colonialism and racism and war are aligned in the West. Yes, they have friends elsewhere, but the ringleaders are in Washington and in London and in Berlin. And so there's an epic struggle going on. One is in Palestine, directly between the Palestinian people and their oppressors, where they are struggling for their own survival and liberation. And then the tentacles of that extend out more broadly at the global level, where we are fighting for an international order in which human rights means something, in which the rule of law means something, in which the sovereign equality means something. All of these ideas after the Second World War, that the genocide in Palestine and its Western underwriting have brought that struggle to a new level, to an existential level. And if Israel gets away with genocide and its other crimes, if it gets away with its attacks on the UN, if the United States and the UK and the Germans get away with their project of impunity, all of that nascent project of a world governed by human rights and the rule of law crumbles. And then it's every person for themselves. Then it is a kind of global conflict that will make World War II look like an argument between two neighbors over a fence. And so we have a lot at stake here. But this is where the hope comes from. The hope comes from the fact that while our corrupted and captured governments have not realized what the stakes are and don't care because their interests are elsewhere, the people of the world have. The people who are most oppressed, the Palestinian people on the front lines, and then those that are standing up to argue against their government's complicity in Germany and the UK and the United States and elsewhere, at risk of police violence, at risk of arrest, at risk of being expelled from the universities, at risk of being slandered as anti-Semites and supporters of terrorism, at risk of family breaches, at every risk, are not only standing up, but their numbers are growing more and more because people have understood. We say this cliche, the first live stream genocide, but it's important, because it means that the New York Times and CNN and Fox News and the governments and these spokespersons for genocide that step up to government podiums, they can't control the narrative anymore. And when you've got electronic Intifada and other independent media and social media distributing the truth in an age of lies and genocide, that's where the hope comes from. So I think we all have a responsibility to make sure that our voices are heard, that we don't bow to this current status quo and to this and to the power, the mendacity and the brutality of those who are in power, and that we resist this. If Palestine wins, we all win, and we have to make sure that everybody realizes this, because if Palestine loses, that's a dark world that's coming. So we're all in this fight, and we have to win.
Amen to that.
Thank you so much, Craig. We could talk to you for hours, and we'll have you on sooner than, what is it, 9 months in between.
No, thank you,
yes.
Nora and Ali. I mean, what you're doing is so important, and thank you for letting me be a part of it. And
anytime.
all my solidarity. Yeah.